postre no la quiso. El valiente cazador ordenó a su comitiva que se la guardara viva en el refrigerador. La naranja se pasea de la sala al comedor. No me tires con cuchillo, tírame con tenedor. Lo hizo en la cocina con una paciencia china. La domaba día a día, la naranja no aprendía. Mono lo hizo con rigor. Al fin la empujó un poquito y dio su primer pasito. La naranja sin error. La naranja se pasea de la sala al comedor. No me tires con cuchillo, tírame con tenedor.
So, well, are you hear me? Are you hear me? Because I had some troubles with internet.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. So we have next the talk of Ben, a research scientist in the Joint Global Change Research Institute. It's very long, the title of your institute, Ben. And well, he works in many things, but many things related to ecosystem and forest, ecosystem respirations, and I don't know if global, but very large levels.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes, I can hear you and see that you have
the
subtitles.
Yeah, I usually do that both in case there's a problem and for hearing impaired audience, it's good. So if people don't mind, I usually leave that on.
I know. I think it's amazing.
It is pretty astonishing what it's not perfect, but it does pretty well. So okay, so thank you, Leo, and everyone for the invitation. Good morning. And so from the last really interesting talk was very wide ranging, and so this one we are narrowing down to a specific experiment in a specific place. And so on looking at tree mortality and tipping points in the forest carbon cycle. And I wanted to thank as well my co-authors, and particularly Chris Goff, who is a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, who's my co-PI on this project, and a number of his and our students who have contributed to it. So the overarching question here for this experiment really was a very common one in ecology, which is, why are some ecosystems functionally stable and others prone to decline following disturbance? And there's been a lot of literature on this, And this sort of really links very nicely with what Ricard said in his after his talk, just a few minutes ago, right? That the idea that ecological diversity is a firewall. I think he said against invasive species, but you could say in some ways against disturbance more generally. And this idea then that species diverse ecosystems are more stable. And in particular, the sort of one of the big hypotheses driving this experiment was looking at the structural complexity. The idea that the structural complexity might be a stronger predictor actually of carbon cycling disturbance response than diversity per se. And the idea here then, right, is that if you have, you're going to subject ecosystems to disturbance, and we have two on the left, one that is architecturally, physiologically diverse, with more of its niches filled, a taller canopy, versus on the right, a less diverse and less structurally complex. And you disturb the first one and, well, both of them, and then they have the more structurally complex one, right, has the might be more resilient because that complexity allows it to take advantage of the changed environment more quickly and more efficiently. And so this is an appealing hypothesis, but we have these simple, powerful, appealing ideas, and how they play out in a complicated real world is not always as clear. But people have thought about this a lot, really, and there's an nice paper from just a few years ago, this Hillebrand paper, actually asking, how can we translate, what are the metrics, some of the metrics we can really quantify to test out some of these ideas. And so they talk about this idea, if on the graph on the right here, if you have a pulse disturbance and you disturb a community, say, from some functional metric on the y-axis, we have a measure of how resistant, say, is the ecosystem to the disturbance, the distance it drops below your pre-disturbance state, and B, sort of the slope at which it may or may not rebound that to some new state would be its resilience. And then you have sort of a new recovery state and temporal stability. These are ideas that Hillebrand et al. Laid out in this paper, and that we then adopted really in parts of this experiment as it played out. And where then we proposed, and starting a few years ago, decided to really test this on a pretty large scale, right? People do this with mesocosms or with in laboratories, but real world ecosystems are bigger. That scale can confer different properties, and they're more complicated. And so these are pictures from the north central United States, from upper northern Michigan in the United States. So these are transition forests between the temperate up to the boreal cold in winter, and they're very different than they were pre-colonization, obviously. But even 100 years ago, disturbances in this system looked like the picture on the left, right? They tended to be complete disturbance, either through catastrophic fire or complete logging, and then you had the ecosystems that have been regrowing for 100 or 120 years since then. And today, disturbances in these forests look like the pictures on the right. They tend to be woody adalgid, or emerald ash borer, or selective, some very small scale storm disturbances, for instance. But you don't have landscape level fire the way you might once have, right? There is human suppression of that scale of disturbance, but you have lots of moderate, spatially discrete disturbances. And that then, so that's the sort of the ecological and spatial context that this is playing out in. For what we called Forte, which was an experiment about forest resilience and threshold. The idea, sort of, we were asking, how far can we push a forest before it collapses? In this case, in carbon cycling terms. And this was prompted by, about 12 years ago, a previous experiment run up at this same place, at the University of Michigan Biological Station, that was called FACET. And here they looked at, this was an accelerated succession experiment. And they said, you know, it has been 100 years, these forests have been regrowing for 100 years since being clear cut and burned. And they're just on the edge of undergoing an ecological transition from the first generation species to later succession species. And we don't fully understand the consequences of that. And so the FACET experiment in large, they had a control with a eddy covariance tower and lots of measurements, and then an experimental forest with another tower. And they girdled, so killed, leaving in place for about 45% of the forest, which was all the early successional sort of birch and aspen trees. So the idea is they're accelerating succession. They're trying to get a picture of what might happen, compress it in time over the next 20 years. Because we know currently that those early successional species are dying off, right? This will take decades to play out. And so this experiment was, let's accelerate it. And they had a hypothesis shown here, which is that, you know, you might see NEP, net ecosystem production, the carbon balance of the forest, after the girdling event in 2008 would swing negative. There might be an initial carbon loss pulse out to the atmosphere, but that the mortality event would make more nitrogen available out to the system, and you would get a quick rebound of NEP in a few years, so that the forest started sequestering carbon again, which it currently was doing. And one of the wonderful things about field science is you have a lovely hypothesis and you run the experiment and something totally different happens, which is the forest, a 45% mortality event. I've been doing forest ecology for a while. I like to think that I know what I'm doing. If you'd asked me, I would have said, you know, the 45% is a large mortality event. Here's NEP, observed carbon balance. The forest basically didn't notice, like in terms of the carbon balance. This is the difference between the treatment and the control. And basically there was almost 45% mortality, and the treatment forest kept sequestering just as much carbon as the control. You did see a surge in nitrogen availability, but again, both leaf area and carbon balance were, to first order, somewhat unaffected. Certainly didn't follow the pre-experiment hypothesis. So that then led, my colleague Chris and I sort of asked, well, FACET, this previous experiment, cut at 45%, and the forest didn't seem to notice in most respects that we could measure. And but there were indications that the structural complexity of the forest was responsible, because they had individual little plots, and more structurally complex plots seemed to be more resilient to this disturbance event, to the mortality event. So we proposed and designed this follow-up experiment where we said, we're going to have a control, and then a 45%, which is the FACET level, and then 65 and 85. So we're going to hit this forest hard enough until it hurts, hopefully. And to look at this structural question, we're going to do it in two different ways. At a given disturbance level, say 85%, we're going to have one set of plots where we kill the biggest trees first until we reach that 85% level. And there will be paired plots where we're going to start with the smallest trees and kill up until we reach, say, 85% or whatever our target treatment level is. So we have 4 levels then. The design was 4 levels of mortality implemented in 2 different ways, bottom up or top down. And this was implemented then at this University of Michigan biological station. And there's a map on the top here of how the disturbance plots were located on the landscape, and the different colors are sort of the different. It is broadly a transition deciduous forest, but there are slightly different types here in terms of dominance or driven. We think by shifts in the underlying soil types, because this is over a few kilometers on the landscape. And so again, we split the plot. We have bottom up and top down mortality designs, and then the graduate students are doing a lot of measurements, both in terms of the structural effects, the carbon cycling, so net primary production, photosynthesis, soil respiration, and then some remote sensing metrics as well. Oh, and here's actually a real visual from Google Earth, and there's this Mariflux tower in the middle of the landscape, and then the treatment plots are right around it. Again, this is about a couple kilometers east to west here. And so we implemented this then in about 18 months ago, so May 2019. We have all the trees marked, and go out and stem girdle these trees. And so again, the focus compared to the previous facet, the focus is not the ecological early succession or later succession in this case. In this case, we have randomly selected the trees, and again, we are hitting our target mortality depending on the plot, starting with the smallest and going to the biggest, or the biggest and starting to the smallest. And the reason we're doing this girdling technique is the idea here is that it kills the tree without letting the tree know it's dead. So if you just cut the tree down and kill it that way, a lot of these trees will then have this burst, the below ground structures will put out this burst of epicormic sprouting, this rapid flush of growth. As a response, to the loss of the above ground canopy. And if you do this and you cut the phloem, the transport down to the roots, the tree starts to quickly die, but it doesn't know it's dying physiologically. And so you don't get this compensatory quick growth response, which if you're interested in carbon cycling could really mess things up. So we did that then 18 months ago. And you could see then even a month, this is 1 month after the girdling, after the disturbance event. And this is looking up in one of the treatment plots, and you can see the untouched trees. And then we have some trees that have been girdled, and you can see they do have some stored carbohydrates, and they are able to very weakly flush out leaves a month later, but they're clearly highly affected. And that continues, well, as we'll see, but that continues. They no longer have, they're no longer able to send photosynthates down to their roots, and so they are quickly dying, even though they have the resources to put out a weak flush of leaves. So then the hypothesis here is that canopy rugosity, so a measure of complexity, would be this structural attribute would allow these disturbed forests to compensate. It would control some of their resistance, and resilience to disturbance, and in particular at higher LAI values, higher leaf area index values, that would be stronger. That this would be additive. So compared, in other words, Yeah. So compared, in other words, to a control at the top, the white line, you know, we would have different levels of resistance depending on both depending on the pre-disturbance state, both in terms of rugosity, complexity, and absolute leaf area index. So a little bit complex, but again, this idea that structural complexity would confer resilience. So then we've had a full year of observations in 2019, and in 2020 a COVID limited year of observations, where we did get some observations, but not as much as obviously as we had planned. And so, and I should put this in a little bit of context, I guess, for a moment. So the idea here from this figure is from the proposal that we wrote, that we did have a full year plus of pre-treatment observations, and then our girdling event, and then in 2019 and limited 2020 field observations. And then the goals of this experiment, there was also a very large modeling part of the experiment that was tightly tied. The goal was to tightly tie it in from the, not just have it be sort of an add-on at the end, but actually to have some pre-experiment modeling work and prediction work, and that then would help inform subsequent years of data collection. So focusing on the field measurements, I guess. So this is from the 2019 field season, and it looks at tree net primary production, particular ANPP, above ground net primary production. And this is a graduate student named Max Grigri, and this is actually recently accepted in forests. And it's quite interesting, which is that the again, I sort of mentioned about how you have these nice these plans and hypotheses, and then funny things happen. And so you can see in the top panel here, black is our control, the control trees, and then the different levels of disturbance. And one thing we saw was these are from dendrometer bands. So these bands around the trees that are precisely measuring tree growth. And you can see in this first year, actually, these trees, the dendrometer bands are above the girdling cut. And we think that they have this swelling, this initial flush, because they can't send any photosynthates down to the roots. You're getting an unusually large storage in the stem. And so you see the, compared to the uncut trees, the undisturbed trees, the disturbed trees actually had higher stem swelling, even though they're dying. They cannot stay alive. They are dying, but they have higher stem growth in this first year just because of what's happening structurally and physiologically in the stem. And interestingly, we don't see any difference in response between our top-down and bottom-up treatments. So again, this killing the biggest trees first or the smallest trees first. To date, and actually there's he's made a couple measurements in 2020 and still doesn't really see any difference there. So the trees although the trees are dying, they're having the cut trees at least are having this unusual stem growth. Also in the category of somewhat unexpected things, I guess, was my colleague Lisa Haber's work looking at understory photosynthesis. And here we kind of expected that in forest stands with higher disturbance, higher mortality event, you might see a ramp up of understory photosynthesis, right? That there's, in theory, with this mortality, there's more light and there's more nitrogen coming into the understory, into the system, and that the understory might take advantage of that and start to increase its photosynthetic rate. And Lisa didn't see that at all. She very limited suggestion of any treatment effects. The 2018 is pre-treatment, 2019 is post-treatment on the right. And her preliminary 2020 data also really don't show a difference. So the understory, if it's is maybe constrained by something else, but we don't see an immediate increase in its photosynthesis with these canopy gaps that have developed. Conversely, this is work from a student, Kayla Mathis, in Chris's lab. And also same idea here. On the left is the pre-treatment 2018 data, and on the right is post-treatment 2019. And on the y-axis is her soil respiration, summary of her soil respiration measurements. And pre-treatment, there's no difference, which is good. We don't want there to be. But post-treatment, she sees an immediate effect that that nicely sequences by disturbance intensity. So over here, right, here's our control, and then 45 and 65 and 85. And so this is the total soil surface flux of CO2 from the soil out to the atmosphere. Another way to look at that, sort of replotting it, would be this. And she also doesn't see any difference in the top-down versus bottom-up disturbance implementation. So, we had some hypotheses, for instance, that killing smaller trees first, you might be killing more fine roots, which might be more physiologically active, but she doesn't see any difference in that top-down versus bottom-up kill. She also so far hasn't seen any effect on the heterotrophic soil respiration. So this decline seems to be, unsurprisingly, but driven by the autotrophic, by the tree roots here. The plant roots are being by design, starved of carbon, of photosynthate, and so it's driving significant. And just looking at the graph, right, the 85% defoliation, she's seeing about a 1/3 decline in total soil respiration. And if that total is of roughly, say, 1/2 heterotrophic, 1/2 autotrophic, that kind of, at least in magnitude, that's seems fairly expected. So that's interesting. But a much larger effect, again, than the above ground so far. Jeff Atkins, who's a postdoctoral scientist with Chris, has also led a whole bunch of work on using NDVI and LIDAR to really quantify the structural characteristics of these forests. And these are both the field work and then a bunch of the hemispherical in the upper right, and then the LIDAR, which was my title slide, was one of his LIDAR images, which are quite beautiful. And he then is able to look at, for instance, in 2019, post-treatment changes in LAI, inferred LAI, or inferred NDVI, which is a greenness, remotely sensed greenness measure. He saw, it was kind of interesting, in the second half of the growing season, he started to see treatment divergences, not at the beginning. So it took a little while for it to develop. So we can try to pull this together. And there's a complicated figure, but what it's showing here is on the y-axis, the three of the things I just showed you. Okay, so on the top, photosynthesis, ASAP, and in particular, the resistance of photosynthesis to disturbance. And in the middle row, it's the resistance of net primary production to disturbance. And in the bottom, the resistance of soil respiration to disturbance. And how is that resistance correlated on the x-axis with pre-disturbance metrics, characteristics of the forest? So species diversity, leaf area index, woody biomass, and rugosity, this measure of complexity. And interestingly, I guess, is that maybe the big thing to point out here is that, sort of what I said before, the below ground, the respiration side is where you really see, to date anyway, in these panels in the lower right, we see more of a relationship where you have higher leaf area index, higher woody biomass, higher rugosity is correlated with sort of the resistance here, versus the picture is much more muddied and less consistent for the above ground up above. So I mentioned there's a piece here that's also a big piece that was modeling in this experiment, right? That they're intended to be synergistic, and with the experiment, the observations feeding the modeling, and the modeling informing subsequent observations, right? That was our loop here in our proposal. And so I'd like to take a look then as well at the modeling component and work that's been done there, and how that then informs back into the field measurements. So this is from my former postdoctoral colleague, Alexei Shiklomanov, who's now taken a position with the US NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. He used the ED2 model, which is it's a demographic model, and so it tracks different cohorts of, say, trees in an ecosystem. And that was a very deliberate choice. It's because a lot of the orientation of this experiment is around different cohorts and canopy layers and structural complexity. And the ED model has a very sophisticated treatment of things like canopy radiation transfer that we thought would be important if you wanted to successfully model this system. And so one of Alexei's first step here was sort of to do a sensitivity parameter analysis, and he's particularly interested here in parameters. It's one thing to say that a model is sensitive to certain parameters, but that may or may not be interesting by itself, right? I mean, we care that the parameters it matters whether they're measurable or not. There's a class of model parameters that are, in essence, internal settings, but not something we can directly measure in the field. And there's some things we can. And then parameters may or may not be influential. And then they may or may not be uncertain. And so an example here would be specific leaf area. So so each panel is a parameter for this ED model, and the 4 different colors are the 4 different plant functional types, PFTs. And then on the y-axis are the parameter values. And so specific leaf area is an example of a parameter that's highly influential. ED, like most models, ecosystem up to Earth system scale models, is specific leaf area these models are very sensitive to specific leaf area. But we have lots and lots of SLA measurements. Okay, the TRI database alone has tens of thousands, of SLA measurements, and so and we have in this case of this specific site, we have lots of SLA measurements. So while the model is sensitive to it, we have very good constraints on SLA, right? So if you're going to prioritize subsequent measurements, for instance, SLA wouldn't be one of your priorities, would be the argument. Root turnover rate, on the other hand, is something that you can see the long distributions here. It's not very well constrained. The model is fairly sensitive to it, and the red pluses in the graphs are our site-specific, the ED default values. So the ED default values are very different from the TRI data, and the model is sensitive to it, and it's something we could measure. So this is an example of something then that in subsequent field years, we would like to get a much better measurement of. And the third example here is ED has a parameter called growth respiration factor. It's very sensitive to it, but it's not something we can measure in the field. It's an ED specific thing that we really have no way to measure. So a big parameter sensitivity analysis, both to inform the subsequent modeling and to inform the subsequent measurements. And Alexei, his next step then was to ask, how well can the model reproduce the observed forest? So if we start it from bare ground in 1900, which essentially is what the real world ecosystem was. It was basically bare ground, cut and burned in 1900. And we are going to, here he's asking how well the model can reproduce the observed forest, one. He is trying a big universe of different parameter values from my previous slide, two, to try to ask what combinations of parameters let us get closest. And then three, he's asking in the different columns. Ed has this somewhat unique ability to turn off and on different structural parts of the model. So canopy light transmission, for instance, can be two-stream or multi-scatter. The particular plasticity can be closed, let me think, static or plastic in terms of some of the parameters. Ed has this ability to let plant functional types change their parameters somewhat. So if you're in an understory, it can have plastic physiology, for instance, versus static physiology. Canopy light transmission, and then in terms of the structural construction of the canopy, it can be what's called closed or finite. But he can try 8 different variations, structural variations of the model, to look at his structural complexity, structural variation or parametric variation, more interesting, and ask how close can the model get, basically. And the answer is, with some combinations, you get very ecologically divergent outcomes. So it really matters what you choose. The lines here are plant functional types, and you can see there are combinations of parameter settings, the rows, and structural configurations in the columns. There are combinations that produce forests dominated by late hardwoods or dominated by pines. So you can have wildly divergent ecology based on the parameters and the model structure. But the good news is actually the best parameters, we think, can produce a forest that's roughly like today's ecology. I think that is, I'm trying to remember which one that is. I think that is C, but I'm not sure. But you can have his overall takeaway, and this was published in Global Change Biology this year, again, is that there are combinations of parameters and structure that can give you a ecologically not perfect, but pretty good forest. And that's useful to know because then Alexei left for his job, which is great. And my colleague Kaylin Dorheim then has taken Ed and is asking, well, given that we know this model can produce a reasonably ecologically realistic forest, how does it respond to our treatments? So she's implemented in Ed the treatments, the 45, 65, and 85% mortality events here. And again, so this is above ground biomass. And you can see this is her forest, the modeled forest growing over time. Excuse me, here's our 2019 disturbance event. And then in above ground biomass, the 45, the 65, and the 85% subsequent future. She's run it out a little bit into the future, 5 years into the future. And so on the one hand, as a first test, that's good. We can successfully kill trees in the model. And what's really interesting, she's finding, and this remains unpublished work, but and I actually am missing a graph. Her GPP, her photosynthesis, gross primary production, very, very attenuated effects. And so in other words, the model forest, even with a 65 or 85% mortality event, photosynthesis compensates very quickly, and you see very small effects. But interestingly, the disturbance effects seem to be accumulating as you follow through in the carbon cycle. So this is net primary production. So photosynthesis basically minus autotrophic respiration, plant growth basically. And you can see, you have to be a little careful. The y-axis here isn't at 0. But you can see that basically, you know, with the 85% mortality event, there's about a 1/3 drop in net primary production that then starts to rebound. But even 5-6 years out, they're not, you know, it's not back. This idea of what state will the ecosystem get back to, you know, we don't totally know, but it's converged some. And this is for the overall carbon balance, so the net ecosystem production. And here you can see, again, the effects sort of seem to be accumulating. And here we're dropping, you know, it's not, the 85% doesn't force the ecosystem to be a carbon source, but it's a very weak sink. It's dropped most of the way towards 0, towards neutrality here. So, it'd be good to try to draw some of these threads together. And so the forte goal then was to couple field and modeling in a look at forest resilience, and particularly to disturbance at different levels. How hard do we have to hit the forest until it breaks? And use this coupled modeling observational loop to try to both improve our ecological understanding and our ability to model this kind of event, an ecosystem. And then the last part of it here, what we promised to do was, again, synthesis and integration. And this is something that my colleague Kyla Dolan at Michigan State is leading, and so she's done a whole series of overpasses. So this is a point cloud, a LiDAR point cloud here, that lets her from the aircraft. The LiDAR is there from the LiDAR return. She can construct canopy complexity, canopy structure, and as well with something like NDVI, measure of productivity, across the landscape. And so the idea then, this remains in progress, would be to take these experimental plots and build them up to a complete landscape level picture of resilience to disturbance. Finally, then, I guess, to summarize, let me note this work was funded primarily by the U.S. National Science Foundation. What we've seen so far in this experiment is that above ground processes so far have been highly resistant to disturbance severity and disturbances so far. Below ground processes have been highly sensitive and commensurate, sort of in proportion to the magnitude of the disturbance. And the net carbon sink observationally has been sustained, maybe, but that's very uncertain, I think, currently. And we have interesting indications, yes, that biomass and complexity give some indication, pre-disturbance biomass and complexity give an indication of resistance to disturbance, but again, not universally by any means. In particular, related to the below ground response, that seems to be really important. And the modeling, we all love to talk about model shortcomings, but it's been very interesting to see how this ED2 model has what it can capture and what it can't. And in a number of dynamics, it's providing some really both priorities for 2021 field observations, but also potentially interesting hypotheses, I think, for instance, related to the accumulation of disturbance effect as the carbon cycle progresses from photosynthesis sort of to eventual heterotrophic respiration. And I want to point out here, and this is something that is online now, and we're in Earth System Science Data, and my colleague Jeff Atkins is his due date is tomorrow. He is just finishing up revisions on the manuscript. is that all the experimental data are available in an R package. And so if you have an idea, if you have a better idea for what might be happening, you can use this open data R package to take our experimental data and test something out or look at something, or maybe, you know, and so that's available now. It's on GitHub, and it will be through CRAN, the R central sort of R repository. So that's been open data notebook, and open data has been a big focus of our work here as well as we've gone through. So with that, thank you very much, and happy to have any questions.
So thank you very much, Ben. It's amazing talk. Any questions? Do you have any questions? I have one that I was thinking that, so if you have very strong effects in below ground and very small effects above ground, and this in time, these effects of in below ground activity will go up to.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. I mean, the way I probably would phrase this is, I think the below ground, I think the below ground is showing the true effect here in a way, because the disturbance was this girdling effect. And so the result of that, like we thought, we didn't anticipate quite how delayed it would be above ground, but it has to come, right? These trees are dying, you know, so I think it will be very interesting in 6 months. I hope that none of the girdled trees this year will flush their canopies. That will be very irritating if they do. They will be zombie trees who do not know they are dead. But Leo, yes, I think that's a good point, and it, you know, it's kind of irritating for in terms of the field experiment, because we only, you know, it's a 3 to 4 year experiment, and we don't want to sit around waiting for these trees to die. But it's physiologically fascinating and kind of ecologically very interesting, I think. Yeah, in effect, we've sort of, although we didn't intend to, we've done a 45 and a 65 and an 85% below ground mortality so far. And so we're sort of getting a window into, if you could magically kill those roots and leave the trees alive, that's kind of what we're seeing for the moment. But then you're right, it will catch up.
Because what I'm interested, you tried to collapse the system, and you can't, but up to now, but it probably will be stronger and stronger effects with more time, and that is a question I was thinking about. How much is the temporal scale for a system to collapse? But because you can expect, it's like that you expect something happens fast, but it's not so fast. That is, the idea is that these things takes time, but we don't know exactly. And
we don't, and it makes, I mean, it's one reason I think, you know, we depend on synthesis and modeling so heavily. And one of the reasons is that, you know, forests are slow moving, and forest ecologists die off, and the forests still keep going. So yeah, no, I think that very property, though, I think gives, you know, sort of some of the it's going to take, right, the combination of, you know, some of the theoretical models that Ricardo was talking, you know, sort of looking at some, and then in his last talk, and mesocosm things we can manipulate quickly at the loss of realism, and then this kind of thing, which is very realistic in a very large scale, but it's hard to the time scale then becomes a problem for us humans. Yeah.
Yeah, but very nice to think about it. It adds more to my thinking about this question about temporal scales of collapse or the tipping points. But we, in this case, we still don't know if the system will collapse or not. That is amazing. I think
That's
it's amazing.
a really good point. And no, and it's distressing, but no, yeah. We're, for this experiment, we're really hoping. So Facet, this older experiment, they've been able to keep following a little bit, through like the last 12 years. And, we would like, Chris, my colleague Chris, and I actually are getting ready to write a proposal for a follow-on, observations, because we would like to, we're going to hit this time limit, as you said, and, it'd be fascinating to follow this for a decade, for instance.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Any other questions? No. In the YouTube page?
We don't have questions in the YouTube page.
Fine. So, okay, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And we have, I don't have the program here. Where is the program? So, at 11, we have the talk by Matthias Sarin. And now we will have a 5 minutes interval. Thank you.
Voy subiendo la presentación, Leonardo.
Dale. Yo tengo que ir a verla. Tomás, ¿estás ahí?
Sí, estoy acá.
Ok.
Okay. ¿Ahí estamos bien, Tomás?
Sí, perfecto.
Está. Ahí sí. Yo perdí la vista de ustedes.
Sí, no está bueno eso, pero bueno.
No,